All right, welcome back to the Aristotle Show, and we're still talking about the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, and in this video I want to talk to you a little bit about chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. 10 and 11 are pretty odd. I'll get to those in a minute. But chapter 8, Aristotle is picking up on what we saw from earlier video. Check those out if these terms aren't very meaningful to you. The arche, the starting point, the arche of ethics, namely, we're looking for the human good, the greatest good for humans. We've disposed of all that Platonic stuff that is highly abstract. Go check that out on a previous video. We're looking at eudaimonia, filling in what it is. So far what we've got is that it's an activity of psyche or soul in accordance with arete, virtue. Now, remember, in the previous video, we had that this arche of ethics, this starting point, was derived via the function argument. And if you don't remember what that is, go back and review it. Now, Aristotle returns again, and this is what I would say is his conservative side. He says, okay, we've got this arche of ethics that comes out of our function argument. We're going to unpack it in the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics. That's the goal, is to lay this out in more detail. What does he mean by psyche? But most importantly, what does he mean by arete? That's going to occupy Aristotle for several books. But he takes a bit of a break here. He says, okay, well, what do people actually say? So Aristotle is deeply concerned, and that's why 10 and 11 will seem a bit odd. But if you think of Aristotle as not some, just telling everybody what is the case, he's saying something like this. Look, we've had this sort of philosophical derivation via this function argument. This arche of ethics, this basic principle, this starting point has come out of a function argument, a philosophical argument, but Aristotle's saying, I want to show you that it's not just dropping out of the sky, that it's not just some sort of basic principle that I went over and went to some function argument and it's got nothing to do with everyday life. No, Aristotle wants to show you that if we look at what people actually say, this basic starting point, this arche of ethics, really conforms to, or at least picks up on, or at least has in harmony with what people say. So he's not saying anything really radical. In other words, Aristotle gives us a little bit of a principle. He says if something is true, namely this arche of ethics, this starting point, if it's true, it's going to be in harmony with all the data. Now, we want to be careful. In harmony with. That Aristotle's not saying that his arche, his fundamental principle of ethics, is going to be exactly what anybody says. He doesn't say that. But by something like in harmony, it means that it's going to at least include or not directly clash with. So you have to have a broad sort of notion of what you mean by in harmony with. It's not going to be identical. No, it's going to be, well, it can include or pick up on, or that most people would, if they thought about this, recognize this arche that Aristotle has laid out as, yeah, that seems kind of reasonable. I can kind of get behind that. Maybe not exactly what I was thinking, but at least I recognize some of my own views in that. That's what he's talking about when he says in harmony with. So, I'm not going to go through all of the views that Aristotle canvasses in this chapter, but he lists a number of views. So, various views. And we've seen Aristotle a couple of times already in the Nicomachean Ethics talk about various views. If you think back to hoi polloi, the great masses, they had certain views about ethics, and Aristotle was saying, well, it's not without reason that they hold those views. So Aristotle is indeed trying to pick up on what's in the culture and refine it. So you can think of sometimes philosophers are really saying, okay, well, what does the public think? Well, let's pick up on maybe the best part of it or the salient part of it or something and refine it, and that will be a philosophical position. Not something radically alien or other, but it's something that most people think. All right, so what are these other views? Well, Some people say, well, eudaimonia, if we think about what is it, people say things like, well, the person who has eudaimonia is living well. And Aristotle says, yeah, I'm basically capturing that. It's an activity of living well. Got that. Other things, eudaimonia is some kind of virtue or a particular virtue. Aristotle says, yep, I got that too. An activity of psyche in accordance with arete, again, virtue. It's a kind of practical wisdom. Aristotle thinks he's got that too, because he's going to say, well, there's different kinds of arete, so that the psyche is active with a certain kind of arete, namely an intellectual virtue. So it's got a practical side, an intellectual side. So I think I got that as well. Particular kinds of wisdom and a variety of things. Eudaimonia also is some would say, is the hedone. The hoi polloi thought it was hedone, the life, hedonism, the life of pleasure. And Aristotle says, well, I've got that too, because it's an activity of psyche in accordance with arete, and arete is going to include things like emotions, and pleasure is going to be important to Aristotle. What he's saying is that, look, my view is going to be in harmony with those who may want a life of pleasure, but my view isn't identical to those people that say, well, life is pleasure. But believe me, Aristotle is not saying that pleasure isn't important at all. It's a necessary part of a good life. Just don't identify it with the concept of eudaimonia. So Aristotle is trying to include as much as he can of what people say, because he thinks it's pretty reasonable, or at least not without reason. People hold the views that they do. So eudaimonia then encapsulates a lot of the best stuff that people think, the best views that are available. So Aristotle's thinking there's a kind of collective sort of wisdom that I want to tap into and refine. And that's really the essence of a fairly conservative position, is you believe in that there is this sort of collected wisdom that the society has. So eudaimonia is going to be the best, the most noble, virtuous, and most pleasant thing, and these various qualities that people talked about will be parts of it. So it's going to be a complex entity that we're talking about, but it's not an entity like a fixed thing or a fixed state. It's an activity. So keep in mind that eudaimonia is going to be an activity. Eudaimonia also, Aristotle says, is going to need external goods as well. You're going to need some things. We need for eudaimonia, we are social creatures. We live in societies. That's the place where human beings live. Human beings really are human beings when we're with others. So in that sense, in order to achieve eudaimonia, you're going to need the help of others. So in achieving eudaimonia, you're going to need not just simply the activity of your own soul in accordance with virtue, to think of it as an isolated soul, but it's going to be with others as well. Hence, some of the later books, Aristotle will talk about a certain way of being with others, namely having friends. Friends are extremely important. So eudaimonia is going to require other people and some external goods as well. Basically, like, you got to have a little bit of money in order to have eudaimonia. So Aristotle is saying that you have to have a little bit of wealth, you got to have some friends, you got to have even a little bit of political power in order to do good things and noble actions. And he says that our possibility of eudaimonia, and he also talks about blessedness, this is going to be spoiled. It's going to be damaged and make it even more difficult if we're deprived of certain things. Like if you don't have good birth or good standing, if you're born in absolute poverty. Or Aristotle also thinks of appearance is important, right? A little bit of beauty. If he says it's very difficult to have a good life, in Aristotle's view, if you're born extremely ugly, extremely poor, extreme poor health, etc., etc., all the things that he would say would make either eudaimonia pretty well impossible or extraordinarily difficult to achieve. These would be roadblocks in the way of a good and healthy life. So low birth, childless, solitary. He lists a bunch of properties that he would say are going to get in the way of having a good life. So in many ways, Aristotle is offering us a bit of a blueprint too. Like, okay, if I want to have a good life, what would be the external goods that I would want to have in place? So it's going to involve not just simply, it's not just a pure attitude. So don't read activity of soul as just an attitude. Aristotle thinks much more than that. It's got to be activity as well, not just how you happen to see the world. He's not pushing a Stoic line, for instance, although he would say attitude, of course, is important. So Aristotle's got a pretty broad notion of eudaimonia and ultimately, as we'll see, what it means to live an ethical and happy life. So, and Aristotle says, you know, that a number of other things that can get in the way is if you have bad friends or bad children or good children and they died on you, and he points out all these tragic things that no doubt he would have seen, because if you always want to keep in mind that life for an ancient Greek was pretty rough. People died of an impacted wisdom tooth. Things that at least in certain Western societies, maybe there's monetary advantage. People don't suffer like that. But in ancient Greece, people died for a lot of things that would be surprising to many of us today. So that's basically, he's trying to stress in chapter 8 that his view is capturing that of his society, and that's why I'd say it's a fairly conservative outlook as to what ethics should be. It should be a reflection of the society. And we'll look a little later at the problems with that. But for now, the important thing is to understand what Aristotle is on about. Criticisms can come a little later. So that takes us to the end of chapter 8. Now I want to move over to chapter 9. Aristotle shifts gears a little bit, and he's going to return to this question here: whence, from where do we get this eudaimonia? He's going to look at that in more detail in book 2 of the Ethics. But for now, he just puts out a couple of comments here. He says, where do we get eudaimonia from? If it's this thing, it's this good, it's an activity, where does it come from? Is it something we learn? Is it something that you can be taught? That was an old problem. Can you teach virtue? Can you teach someone to be good? Can you teach someone to be happy? So that was an old problem. You find it in Plato. Aristotle is definitely raising it here. Or is it something that comes from habituation? Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between learning and habituation? Well, learning is more like textbook learning, like when you learn in sort of what some would say now the old-fashioned way. You learn through a lecture, and you just take notes, and you just think about it. Habituation is a little bit different, where it's more like practice, where it's more like hands-on. So habituation is where Aristotle is ultimately going to lean towards the how you acquire eudaimonia. It's through habituation. It's through practice. It's through doing things. Is it some other type of training, he asks. So he's really asking the old question. If we think about, because we're talking about the good and the happy life, and the good and the happy life coincides or correlates in Aristotle's view of the moral life, like being a good person is to be a happy person. Those are ultimately linked for Aristotle. When you think about the source of eudaimonia, you're really asking that old question that most of us have asked at least once in a while: are we naturally good or naturally bad or something? Aristotle's actually going to give us an answer for that. And he says, with habituation, what we've really got is that we can become good or become virtuous. We're not just born virtuous. We're born, as he will talk about later in book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's something that you can acquire. You can acquire this eudaimonia through habituation, which means it's possible. But it's not necessary. It's by no means a given. Now, Aristotle says, is it possible that eudaimonia is like a divine state? Is it maybe like a gift from the gods? Now, repeatedly, Aristotle links notions of being blessed with eudaimonia. The truly happy person is a blessed person. And we often talk like that. Oh, I live a blessed life or a charmed life. I'm so happy. And then we're nervous because something might go wrong. Well, in that sense, Aristotle says, well, it might be a divine gift. It could be. And he certainly says in various places in this work, he says, well, if anything is a divine gift, it's going to be happiness. It's going to be eudaimonia. To have a life that, as we've seen earlier, to have something that gives your life meaning, that definitely would be, if anything, a divine thing to have in your life. So he doesn't necessarily rule this out, and we'll see that the link to the divine comes around quite often throughout the Nicomachean Ethics. I take the view that we should be taking Aristotle quite serious when he brings in things about the divine and things that maybe strike us now as not sort of a naturalist, empirical, and physicalist approach to ethics, but more of a spiritual one. I think Aristotle does definitely have a touch of that. I think another thing that's important here is when Aristotle says, oh, maybe it's all by chance. And we've seen earlier, recall in the earlier video when I was looking at this, the function argument. And Aristotle draws that analogy in the function argument between purposes. Remember when we talked about if you have a purpose, you're a human being and then you're a carpenter. And you have a purpose as a carpenter, and your purpose is to do carpenter things, building a bridge, or building a house, or building a jewelry box, or whatever, or a chair, or furniture. You have a purpose, something that you're there to do. Likewise, your eyes, Aristotle says, their purpose is to see. And remember, Aristotle says, well, it would be really odd and frankly unacceptable if the parts of your body and the activities that you do as a carpenter or as a cobbler or whatever job you do, that there's all that purpose there, but you as a human being, qua human, have no purpose. That just seems inappropriate and unacceptable. Well, the same thing Aristotle is going to say over here with regards to eudaimonia, the greatest thing that we can have, the thing that gives all of our life meaning. Could that just come about by chance? No. Aristotle thinks that, once again, is inappropriate and just, it strikes him as ridiculous. And keep in mind that what strikes Aristotle as ridiculous, or maybe what strikes you as ridiculous, could be heavily culturally conditioned or sociologically conditioned. So it's a good idea to just figure out, why does he think the notion of chance being an explanation of the origin of eudaimonia as ridiculous? Well, it just goes against everything he thinks about what human beings are. And we're not just products of chance living these meaningless lives. That's not an Aristotelian picture. All right. Now, in addition to this, Aristotle makes an interesting point where he thinks that unless something's gone terribly wrong with you, the average person can have eudaimonia. Everyone should really be able to get it. Which raises certain kinds of questions. How important then, how many friends should you have? How many external goods, etc., etc.? Well, Aristotle is sort of laying down a basic notion of the average person who's got, you got some stuff to eat, you're not born all disfigured and all these kinds of terrible physical afflictions or whatnot. Aristotle, you're not bad looking, all these kinds of things, and you're reasonably intelligent, and you've got some friends, and you've got some external goods, like you have a house and things like that. All things considered like that, you should be able, he says, to achieve this greatest good, this state of eudaimonia. So in that sense, everyone should be able to reach this state. And this, I think, makes Aristotle a little bit different than Plato, because Aristotle doesn't lay, as we've seen, as much intellectual emphasis on ethics as Plato does. Plato had the very sort of scholarly and very abstract notion of the good. Aristotle's is very practical and down to earth, and he thinks everyone, all things considered, should be able to achieve it, unless something's gone horribly wrong in your life, or you've had a terrible start. Then the odds of you getting it are pretty well zero. All right. Now, I mentioned that we get a bit of an odd thing because I do take Aristotle seriously when he talks about divine things, because they come up so often. In chapter 10 and 11, you get what many scholars thought was a very odd discussion. And I think it is a little odd too, but it makes a little more sense when you think of Aristotle. Again, as I've mentioned, Aristotle is very concerned about what people say. So he wants various views. Now, I listed a bunch of those things as to what eudaimonia is, but what was very common at the time, which if you haven't really read a lot of Greek literature, you may not think about, but there were a number of Greek writers, that all the tragic writers and the comedy writers. Aristotle knew a lot about these writers, and they had a huge influence. So we now may not be quite as familiar with them. But one thinker that was quite well known was Solon. Solon was often referred to as the lawgiver. And Solon lived about a century before Plato and Socrates, and a little bit more than that of Aristotle. But he was a very respected figure. You can find a lot of references to him. And Solon is sometimes credited with laying the foundations, the intellectual foundations of Greek democracy. I don't want to go into that side. What I'm interested in is a little aphorism that was attributed to him, is Solon was arguably quite cautious. He said, you really shouldn't call someone happy. I'm paraphrasing here. You shouldn't call someone happy until death, until they've died. Right? Why? Well, because things could go terribly wrong. And if you look at Aristotle's example, classic example from the Iliad, is King Priam of Troy. When he's the king of Troy, and he was doing everything was going really well, of course, until the Trojan War. And if you know that story, and if you don't, go out and read it. It's a classic tragedy. The king, he's got all this wealth and power, and then the war comes. He's losing the war, but his son Hector is eventually killed in front of him by Achilles. And not only is his son killed by Achilles, Achilles is very disrespectful afterwards and drags Hector's body around the gates and the walls of Troy and endlessly, just to basically torture Hector's parents. So, and we say, oh, this was, everything was going really well, and that happens. So that idea of you really shouldn't talk about eudaimonia until someone's dead, right? Then you could say, yeah, that was a happy life. But also Aristotle says, what about the dead themselves? Well, again, going back to the various views that he talks about and takes very seriously, at that time the Greeks did worry about the dead, and were they happy? And so this notion of an afterlife played a role in their thinking. And of course, in many religions subsequently, you think of all the prayers for those in purgatory. That's another thing of worrying about the dead, and in later religions. So this idea of happiness and the dead, if you are thinking of it in a strictly non-religious format, of course, it's not going to make any sense. But if you think about it in the context of Aristotle's time and what people were worried about, they did worry about stuff like this, right? They did worry about their ancestors, and are they happy and whatnot. Aristotle says, okay, well, he struggles a bit with how to interpret what Solon is saying, but the main point that Aristotle gets at is in chapters 10 and 11 is that the dead are affected by what we do and what happens. So their eudaimonia or their states can be affected by what we do. But in the end, he says, probably not all that terribly much. And again, some scholars say, well, this is just throwaway material. We shouldn't take it all that seriously. But you can read it in the context, as I said, of Aristotle's work of looking at what people say. And it's really not easy to make his notion of eudaimonia, which, remember, is an activity of soul, to square very easily with anybody that's dead. So he's got a bit of tension there, and whether or not he can really make it all work is debatable. But he certainly, my point is simply that he did take it quite seriously. All right, so there you have this next bit of, we've got a little bit more of Aristotle, shall we say, his conservative side. He's talked about that. He's worried about what other people say. He thinks he's got something that, remember his arche about the activity of psyche in accordance with arete. He thinks he's got something that everybody can relate to, even those people that worry about how the dead feel. So this is taking us very close. A couple more chapters and we'll wrap up book 1. So stay tuned for the next video.